Thank you,
This is crazy.
Completely insane.
Oh, it's driving me nuts?
I mean, the whole gun thing, it just makes me really hot.
Yeah.
Well, it's a hot issue, and I'm getting hot about it, too.
This is good. We're all hot at the same time. We should do something about
I mean, our schools aren't safe.
There are people out on the streets with assault rifles?
We're living in constant fear.
Oh, guys, we gotta get more guns on the street.
Yeah,
baby.
Wait, what?
We gotta get more guns onto the streets.
Yeah, we gotta get guns in the right hands. I mean, we're just not safe.
That's what you guys are hot about?
Yeah, didn't you hear what Frank
Yeah,
said?
What are you hot about?
There are too many guns on the streets as it is. Guns off the streets is what we need.
Way too easy for anybody to just walk into a store and get a gun.
No, it's not. And it's getting harder and harder. The government's trying to take our guns away. It's way harder than you think, dude.
Guys, we're hot about the complete opposite.
Shoot.
Which is a bummer, because I thought we were on the same page for once.
Still very hot, though.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm even hotter if I'm being honest.
Still hot.
It's another day, another lecture. So we're getting going on the Bill of Rights. We're also going to talk about the 27 amendments as well. This lecture is significantly less of a hassle than the Constitution lecture. That one was very long and tedious, but this one also has a lot to it, but we can go through it a bit faster. Today is really just about civil liberties, and what your civil liberties are has probably been the most significant part of the Constitution itself is actually the changes that we've made. The addition to these Bill of Rights really laid out what the government could not do. We had said before what the government could do, but this is what the limitations of government were. And having that limited government was a great balance to the very strong government that they had created in the Constitution. There were anti-federalists who believed that this was the time to put in something that was also saying how the government should be limited in what they can do to each individual citizen. To start talking about the Bill of Rights, we need to start talking about the history behind it. As we talked about last week, the Constitution was officially ratified in 1789. After that point, there had been a discussion about adding in specific rights. But a lot of the Federalists who had written the Constitution did not see the need for the Constitution to lay out each individual right or liberty that a person had, because they would just be an ever-ending list of liberties that a person would need. If there was a limitation on that, or there wasn't something specifically laid out, it could really affect the rights of each person. So the Federalists believed it was unnecessary and kind of an overkill. The Anti-Federalists, and what later became most of the establishment of the Republican Party, believed in a very firm belief that there needed to be some sort of limitation on the government. There had been a great balance of power to make sure a strong government wasn't going to take advantage of each individual part of the government. It never really laid out the parts where the government could not infringe on the rights of citizens, besides just saying that rights couldn't be taken away for martial law. But to protect themselves from another type of monarchy, where a monarchy that took advantage of them on a regular basis, the people believed that there needed to be specific rights that were laid out where they knew what they were, and the government also could not infringe upon them. That is not something that was common back then, where you could amend the Constitution and then add these amendments that would give each individual person these rights that were given to them at birth. And it was Jefferson who really led this charge. Jefferson actually has a great quote about this, in which he said, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference." So saying that just because a government is trying to infer that everybody does have rights, spelling out those each rights was very important to making sure that the government could not take advantage of everybody. So the Constitution was ratified in 1789. For almost 2 years after the official ratification of the Constitution, there was this point in time where they were trying to get these amendments through. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. It was inspired by Jefferson and written by James Madison. So again, Madison kind of played both sides, where he was considered more Federalist, but he also began to have more ideas that were Republican or anti-Federalist as well. And that was the backdrop where he kind of balanced out the strong independent government, but also the rights of the citizens and he added these Bill of Rights right after the Constitution. These were the first 10 that were the first changes to the Constitution. The word liberty actually means the state of being free within a society from oppressive restrictions imposed by an authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political view. And so this meant that liberties were never meant to be taken away, that liberties were meant to be in place no matter what the government said. They could not be taken away whatsoever. So we're just going to go right into the Bill of Rights now, and we're going to talk about what exactly is in them. The first one is the First Amendment, and that really lays out just the freedoms that everybody is allowed to have. And this is arguably the most important one because it just lays out every single right that you have as a free citizen in this country. The first thing that it lays out is the freedom of religion. You can practice what you believe. You're allowed to practice what you feel. What belief you have. It doesn't matter if you have a belief or you don't. You're allowed to practice freely in this country, no matter what religion you are. That is still an important right to this day, and luckily that has not been trampled on for the most part. But that was an essential part of this. They didn't want to be associated with any particular religion. So having the freedom for people to practice what they choose and not be subservient to the Catholic Church or to the Anglican Church or to any large religious group was an essential part of our government. There remained a separation of church and state, so there was never a feeling of a majority of a religion where people did not feel free to live here or practice here. The second is freedom of assembly. That meant you have a right to protest. You can gather with all your friends and protest whatever you feel like, really, as long as it's within reason in terms of like it's not violent, basically. And this is a tricky one because sometimes people put in restrictions on certain areas that are private. Public areas always have usually an area where you can protest, but you sometimes need a permit. This is another one that kind of gets ruffled a little bit. There is definitely a right to protest in this country. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You have a right to protest and make your voice heard. You are not going to be put into jail for saying what you believe. The third is freedom of the press, and this is an interesting one as well. And this was infringed upon actually since the very beginning of our country. There were plenty of libel laws that were put into place that kind of limited the freedom of the press, and those had since been restricted. Even from that point, there's been many cases where the freedom of the press has been challenged and is being challenged, especially right now. Some of that is the media's own doing and what they claim is journalistic integrity, and then sometimes it's just they are challenging authority and they almost get railroaded. It's a tricky situation to have a freedom of a press, and we really have one of the most free presses in the world. There's other countries that have democracies and they kind of limit the freedom and access to the press too. So it's a good thing to have the freedom of the press, but it's also really important to discuss what that means and how it can be used as a tool. And later on this year, we're going to talk about the role of media and why it is an essential part of our government. And some people call the media the fourth branch of the government, and that's because it kind of balances out and calls into question certain parts of our own government system. The fourth one is the freedom to petition, and that is the right to present requests to the government without punishment. So you are able to petition the government for certain needs or wants, and you're not going to get punished for coming to somebody from that. So you can go to your representatives and say, there needs to be help. I need help funding this project, or help funding what I need. You can go to your representative and talk to these people because they are there to help you, or they should be there to help you. And you cannot be punished for just coming and asking for something like that. You can ask, they can deny you, but you can at least ask for it. And that's not something you could be thrown into jail for. The last one, and arguably the overarching reach of all this, is the freedom of speech. You have the right to speak your mind without punishment. And that kind of delves into all these different areas of the freedoms that we have. Freedom of speech is an essential part. That does not mean you're free to say whatever you feel like necessarily. You have a responsibility as an individual citizen to control the speech that you have. You still take the responsibility for the freedom of speech that you put out there. A woman a few years ago used this argument where she got fired from her job when she posted on Twitter a very racist tweet, got on a plane, and by the time she landed, she was fired from that job. And she claimed that it was infringing upon her freedom of speech. Well, that's not true. This is just that the government can't limit or punish you for speaking your mind. That does not mean that you as a private citizen working for a private company cannot fire you because you said something that was outrageously racist or against their beliefs as well. So they as a company are allowed to have their own freedom, and they are allowed to fire you because you said something that was against what they believe. You're not free to do whatever you want. That's the responsibility part of freedom of speech. If you tweet something or you say something on social media or you say something to somebody that is very offensive, that does not mean you are free from the consequences of expressing your speech. If you're part of a racist hate group, you probably are going to get reprimanded. You're not going to get hired on many things because you are saying things that are definitely against the qualities that some people see or want to see in employees. Now we come to the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. And this is arguably the most controversial now. And this is the one that kind of riles people up whenever there is a significant mass shooting or there's something that happens in our country that kind of makes people question why we still have the Second Amendment. And it was written at the time because the Founding Fathers believed that the people should have a way to rebel against any government that they felt was oppressive. At that time, that meant that people weren't allowed to take away somebody's gun or their ammunition or anything in case they wanted to take up arms. And this was because most of the armies back then were just a bunch of dudes who were in the neighborhood and could put together a militia together pretty easily if they needed to protect their land or they needed to protect each other. So this was not a simple thing of just they wanted guns and that was it. This was to protect their land. But now it's kind of turned into this thing where it means that anybody can have any gun that they want at any time, and any limitation on a firearm is seen as an infringement on the rights of a person to own firearms. There is an argument to be able to protect your own land, your own property, your family, whatever it is. There is a certain argument to be made that maybe this is a bit outdated from the time, because the reason why the Founding Fathers laid this out was because at that point, if you put together a couple muskets and a couple guys, you can probably fight off a good amount of the army. Now, you're probably not going to fight off the U.S. military. It's a giant beast. You're not going to fight them off. If you're going to fight the U.S. Army, you're probably going to lose for the most part. So you putting up getting a bunch of guns together isn't going to make sure that you're really that safe at all. But the sentiment, I understand, but it's a little harder to make some argument when people are buying something to protect their home or to have an AK-47. I don't know if that's really the point. And that's why I showed that clip at the beginning from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. That whole episode of that TV show is hilariously interesting because by the time that you see the two groups who one wants more arms, one wants less guns, they end up switching positions at the very end of the show because they both go through all this mess. And it's a great look at how we have this argument today about the right to bear arms and guns and what role they should have in our society. And there is some argument to be made for maybe limiting this, and who knows if that will ever change. But if this were to be changed significantly in terms of having ammunition, it would probably need to be an amendment unless there was something to specifically talk about this. This could be a big court case in the next few years in the Supreme Court, I would imagine, that could challenge something like this. There's a large lobby around the protection of the Second Amendment. So this is something when we get to political parties and super PACs and things like that. The NRA is a huge influencer in the political world. Amendment 3. This one is an interesting one because it says there's no quartering of troops during times of war. So during the Revolution, there would be times where a British soldier could come into somebody's home and they would have to feed them, clothe them, and then they would have to let them sleep at their house. This was kind of messy, as you can imagine, that a British soldier's coming in, and if somebody is for the revolution, they could just stay at their house whenever they wanted to. So this was a big problem at the time. Now it's not really that much of an issue. More than likely, if a soldier is going to be coming around somebody's neighborhood, they're going to have a place for them to sleep. But it's still a protection that we have. If there is a soldier who comes to your house and it's during times of war, and somebody comes to your house and they're like, I need to sleep at your house and get your food, you can tell them, no, you're not coming into my house. It's my private property. So it's kind of a protection of private property thing. It's really not that useful anymore, but, it's there. This is where we start getting into the interesting ones, which really kind of cover the whole gamut of the judicial system. It kind of limits the power of the judges and also made sure that there was a system in place that gave everybody due process. Number 4, no search without a warrant. So you cannot search somebody's car unless you have a warrant or you have reasonable doubt that they aren't committing a crime. If you see something on the road, if a cop sees you on the road and you're driving erratically, they have a right to pull you over and check your car because that's reasonable search and seizure. So this is protecting against unreasonable search and seizure. No searching without a warrant, making sure that there is something there when you first start a legal case, that somebody can't just come through your house without going to a judge first, having some reasonable belief that you are committing a crime. But in public situations, like in an airport, they're allowed to look through your materials because it's supposed to be the protection of the people. So again, this is kind of limiting that search and seizure. That's why at an airport, you have to go through security in order to make sure everybody is secure, and that's limiting the rights of people. But for the protection of the individual. Number 5, this one talks about a lot as well. It lays out a couple of different levels of what the court can and cannot do to you. So everyone is afforded due process under this system. Everyone has the same legal process. They always are arraigned, they're arrested, arraigned, they have a court date, they have a trial, they have all this stuff that is a standard legal procedure in every single court case. This also protects against self-incrimination, meaning that if you are arrested, you can plead the fifth, meaning that you can stay silent and you don't have to say anything until you get to a court of law or you get to your own lawyer who can speak on your behalf. So you cannot say something that is basically used against you eventually. That means that you're not going to be forced or tortured to say something. This also lays out the concept of double jeopardy. You can't get tried for a crime twice. So if you are found innocent of a crime, you are never going to go back to court under that same crime. So, for example, O.J. Simpson is a good example of this. O.J. Simpson was found innocent. They cannot try him again for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson because it's double jeopardy. He has been found innocent. He is innocent under the eyes of the law for that murder. The question is whether he did do it. So that's kind of where the government can't go back and say, well, we found new evidence of OJ's guilt. We're going to try him again. They can't do that. And they can't even go back and try him if he were to admit to killing her. When somebody is found innocent under the eyes of the law, even if he went on television and said, I killed her, they cannot try him again because they under that same murder. And they cannot do that if they found even new evidence, whatever it was. The trial is the trial, and that's it. So double jeopardy is a protection from that. Some people argue against it, but it really is important. You don't want to be tried for the same crime over and over again. For example, in Italy, right now, Amanda Knox, who was a college student in Italy, an American student in Italy, was tried for a murder and multiple times got found innocent of that murder and guilty of the same murder. So she would go to a different court each time and be tried for the same thing over and over again until eventually she went to the Italian Supreme Court and they found her innocent. It was just a whole almost 10 years for her of being stuck in jail. And whether she did it or not also, she really was found guilty, innocent, guilty, and innocent again, I think is how the order went. But Italy doesn't have double jeopardy, so she can keep being tried for the same thing over and over again. Now, if you're found guilty of something, you can appeal that, but that's an entirely different case. That's why the appeals process is different. It's not like they just wipe that murder charge clean. You have to appeal that case and then be found either guilty or innocent again. Amendment 5 also lays out eminent domain, meaning the government can take your property but must pay you for it. This is going to be a big issue when it comes to the border wall that President Trump might build. Depending on when this is being seen, he may have started building it. But eminent domain is going to be an issue because there are many properties along the border between the United States and Mexico that are privately owned. So whether the government has to seize that and then pay the people is going to be a legal challenge too. There's probably going to be many people who do not want to sell that land or at least let there be a border wall built on it. So this is going to be some issues where eminent domain might come into effect in the near future. And it also lastly lays out the idea of the grand jury. So these are the people, usually sometimes secretive. It depends on the type of jury that you have. But a grand jury, usually if they decide if there is enough evidence to go to trial, and they decide whether the trial continues from that point. So a grand jury is different from the actual jury during the trial to decide whether there is enough information to either for a murder case or for financial crimes, whatever it is, they're the ones who decide whether there's enough evidence to proceed with the trial. Amendment 6 talks about a speedy trial. So this means that you're not going to be just on trial endlessly over and over again. Trials last a long time. Sometimes they can go a couple years, they can go a couple months, couple weeks, maybe a couple of days. But there would be times in the English system that it would drag on and on and on and on and on. So they can keep you in jail perpetually without putting you on trial. You would just be in jail basically without being found guilty for that crime that you committed. So this guarantees that you're going to have a speedy trial. Depends on what the crime that you're committing and how long how much evidence there is, how long it takes to set up the trial. It could be a long time that you go to court for any particular reason. But it's not going to be like you're in trial perpetually. Like you're going to get a trial done eventually within the reasonable amount of time it's going to take to present each side of the case. Amendment 7 lays out the right to sue. This is usually lays out for civil suits. So we have two different court systems which we're going to talk about: criminal and civil suits. Criminal is when there's a crime committed against the state, against the government, against an individual person that directly challenges a law. The 7th Amendment actually lays out the idea of the civil court, that you are allowed to sue an individual person for something that they did wrong against you, for financial reasons, for property, for whatever it might be. It protects the right to a jury in a civil case and protects jury decisions from being overturned. It really established an entire wing of the court system, the civil side of this, where you can sue somebody for wrongdoing. This is a huge part of our legal system, and it gives people the right to give them property back if they feel that they were wronged and they are found to be wrong. The last one that kind of deals with at least trial stuff is the 8th Amendment. That is no cruel or unusual punishment. This means that there's no excessive or cruel bail or punishment, meaning that they can't just put an excessive amount of bail on you over a crime that's really minor. For example, let's say like you stole something, you're not going to have the same bail as somebody who murdered somebody. Those bails are excessive if you are trying to basically financially ruin somebody. There's some argument now that some of our bails in our bail system are insane, and it kind of puts people in a horrible hole when they are arrested for a crime. It can really cause some issues with their family, especially if they already don't have a lot of money, or to try to get bail is really, really difficult sometimes for some people to afford. The punishments can't be something that is cruel or out of the ordinary. They have to be something that you go to prison. You're not going to be strung up on something where you get your arms pulled out like Game of Thrones style. No, you're going to go to jail. You're going to do something that at least is considered reasonable. The 9th Amendment is people have unlisted rights. This is basically saying that there are unlisted rights that people have that aren't listed on this Constitution or these amendments, because they're not going to just excessively keep adding more and more rights for people. That people have rights until they don't, basically. It's called the Enumeration Amendment. It cannot list every right. It's just impossible. And this was the argument from the Federalists, saying that you're just going to sit there and just each day, people have the right to walk, people have the right to breathe, people have the right to do this, have the right to live, whatever it is. You just can't do that. So everybody basically has a right until they don't have one, until there is some law that's put into place that limits the rights of each person. It's kind of this blanket cover that makes sure that people are protected, that the government can't just come in there and say, well, nobody has these rights anymore. No, you have those rights until you don't. And it's really important for decisions like Roe v. Wade, for example. This was a huge part of the argument in Roe v. Wade, the court case. It laid out that women have the right to seek out some medical procedure that is deemed safe in order to make sure that they have the right to choose, basically. So Roe v. Wade used the 9th Amendment as a way to kind of justify that they have these rights and the government can't limit them, especially if it shows that this is safe and practical. And you can argue that too, depending on your own beliefs too. But that was what the government found, or at least the court decided. And the last important one for the Bill of Rights is the 10th Amendment. And this lays out any power not given to national government is reserved for the states, meaning that any law, any part or power of the federal government that is not under their purview belongs to the rights of the states. And this really laid out a lot for states' rights and is used consistently in a lot of different court cases, because when states go and sue the federal government for certain things, they usually use the 10th Amendment as an argument for their own individual rights as a state. This is why we have marijuana law, for example. In California, it's legal here, but it's not legal federally. So it's really important for defining how we define our rights in each individual state and as a large federal government too. So now we get into the next part of this lecture, which is, now that we've gone through the Bill of Rights, we're going to talk about the other amendments to the Constitution. And this kind of jumps around in history a little bit, but I like talking about it because it lays out why these amendments were so important and how they built on top of the other amendments as well, the first 10. So some of these are really simple, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but other ones are really important, and we'll talk about them. Some of them you might know in terms of why they were laid out, but don't really know what they did or that they came around later on. So the 11th Amendment. This actually protects states from being sued by out-of-state citizens, foreigners, or foreigners not living within the state. This was done so that way somebody living in Nevada couldn't sue California for something for their own rights in California. A California citizen has to sue in a California court. It kind of gives states freedom and individuality from other states. On top of that, too, they weren't going to be sued by a foreigner as well. And this kind of protects just the overall federal structure of our government, that somebody needs to sue an individual person. They need to be a citizen of the United States. They cannot be a foreign entity, basically. This was drafted and amended in 1795, so it's the first amendment after the other 10. Amendment 12, this was a new presidential election rule. And this was in 1804, just after the election of 1800, which was a contentiously debated election and really was close. We're going to talk about this when we come into voting and political parties. At the time of the founding of the country, the president and vice president weren't on the same ticket, quote unquote, like we have now. Now, when somebody is running for president, they choose a running mate who will then be their vice president, and that person will be the one who's chosen with them. When this first started, what happened was the first person who would get the most votes would become president, but the second place person would become the vice president. And this was trying to protect against rivalry between two individual people who didn't really work well together. You could have somebody from completely different parties who believe completely different things, and they would be the vice president to that president. So it really did not work. They knew that this was one of the things they really needed to change. This was really confusing for some people. This meant that people had to use the popular vote as a way to make sure that when a president chooses a running mate, they were able to be protected and have somebody who actually agreed with them ideologically. It kind of was like a backdrop of what happened with the political parties at the time. There was about a 60-year period where there was not another amendment to the Constitution. We didn't have that many after that. And the next one comes in 1865, and this is the abolishment of slavery. It basically says who is a citizen, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and Due Process Clause. It gives rights to all citizens, including former slaves. This was a culmination of really a couple years of fighting over this, but also really made sure that the North was free and America was free from this oppressive idea of slavery. And really, it almost tore our country apart. Obviously, the Civil War is one of the bigger events of our country's history. And slavery was an unfortunate part of how we built our country. We were kind of behind Europe as well. Europe at this point had a couple decades now where they didn't have slavery. And we were one of the last few ties to that big slave trade. Abolishment was a long time coming. It was something that the founding fathers argued about when they first founded the country, but as time went on, they realized they needed to basically just make a country first before they could get rid of slavery, and that's an unfortunate part of our history. But the 13th Amendment was that remedy for all this. Almost 100 years after the Declaration of Independence is when this finally came into practicality. The next is the 14th Amendment, and this was 3 years after the abolishment of slavery, and this basically says who is a citizen. All citizens are equal. This lays out the equality that every citizen, no matter their skin color, their religion, their race, anything, they were considered a citizen of the United States, and everyone had the same rights. So there was nothing that a state could do to try to force somebody who was of a different race to be any less than them. And this was a big issue after the abolishment of slavery. Slaves were still not given rights. They are former slaves at that point were not given rights. So this kind of set this precedent of being and oppressing different races still even after the abolishment of slavery. The 14th Amendment kind of protects those rights of each individual citizen, and it reiterates who is a citizen. The 15th Amendment, this is an amendment that said all men can vote. And that means that there would be no denying of a vote because of somebody's race. Again, there's 3 amendments that deal with race, one after the other. And this was adopted in 1870, that there were still people who were denied their ability to vote and because of they were black. And this laid out that right that it doesn't matter their skin color. And at that point, as long as they were a man, they could vote. Again, it was that first process of emancipating the slaves and giving suffrage to African Americans, and then at the same time, eventually giving suffrage to women. So again, we go a couple more years. It's about 43 years later, after 1970, after the 14th Amendment. And in 1913, there's a new amendment that says that Congress can tax income. This is the establishment of income tax, meaning that people can be taxed for the money that they make, and the government had to have some sort of way to have a verifiable income. The government needed a regular source of money. People were going to constantly be needing money, and they couldn't fund themselves very regularly, so they needed to tax income. And this is a hotly debated one. I'm sure there's many people who argue that this should be shot down in court because it's illegal, but it is a part of our constitutional amendment. It is part of our Constitution now, and that's why we have income tax now. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of U.S. senators by popular vote. And this was also also established in 1913. At this point, a lot of the senators were chosen by state legislatures, so there wasn't a popular vote for senators at that point. People could just vote for their congresspeople. Now we have a popular vote for senators, and this is a direct clearing of the 17th Amendment. It made this possible by doing this. This is where we start getting into the more contentious ones near the end of these amendments too. The 18th Amendment prohibits the sale of alcohol in 1919. This was largely brought on by a group of suffragettes who believed that men were committing these acts of atrocities in the world because they were alcoholics, and it prevented the sale of alcohol and really established the idea of prohibition. Alcohol was illegal for almost 10 years in the United States, and this is a really interesting and fascinating time. If you guys ever have time to read stuff about American history, this is a time that I would definitely suggest you read, because it's not talked about much in history classes, but it's so interesting. The use of alcohol was really excessive at that point, and alcoholism was rampant. So they believed that just by getting rid of alcohol, this would be able to prevent the country from kind of going into this moral decay. The 19th Amendment is now women's suffrage, and this means that women had the right to vote and a right to participate in elections after this point. The participation of women in this system was a huge change in our culture. You now add 50% more voters and a completely different voting population. Over time, it has changed, but now it's really come into effect that women are such a significant portion of the voting population in the United States. They vote more than men usually. This was kind of playing off that power from the Prohibition era. Women had a lot of power and a lot of ability to organize, and they used their power and their influence to push forward women's suffrage. It was a long fight, but it finally came through. And it took many, many years, but it has now really changed the way our country kind of functions, honestly. The 20th Amendment says that the president will take office in January. It used to be December, but that changed. I think that just gave Congress more time to kind of come together. People were from all over the place at this point. The country was expanding by 1920. This was adopted in 1933, and at that point, the country had pretty much almost all 50 states at that point. It was getting close to it. So the country was huge, and I think it just gave more time for people from other parts of the world to kind of take and get to the capital if they needed to. I don't really know why this is, and I've tried to look up more information about why the 20th Amendment came into power, but now we have an inauguration in January. It just gives people more time. Maybe it was after Christmas too, so maybe there are a lot of things that went into that. But now the inauguration for a new president happens in January. The 21st Amendment now kind of remedies the 18th Amendment because people realized that prohibition wasn't really working. People were going to jail for making alcohol. There was already alcohol available anyway. The Prohibition era kind of had this underground vibe of just alcoholism. So it was still rampant. So people were like, why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. They ended up bringing alcohol back in, and this is the 21st Amendment that was adopted in 1933 as well. The 22nd Amendment makes the president's term limits 2, so they can't go more than 2. There's only one president to have ever done that. That's FDR. He served almost 4. He was elected to 4, served a full 3 terms, and then his last term, the 4th, just at the beginning, he died. He's the only president to have done this, and there's no other president before that. But for this, it was really the establishment for Washington who decided he only wanted to serve 2 terms. He probably could have served a lot more, but he was older at that point, and he was just tired, and he really said, like, somebody needs somebody new. It can't be me, and we need to have the country move on. So he laid out this principle that really you're only supposed to serve 2 terms. And many presidents for a long time only served 1. There was like a period in our history where we just kept going back and forth between guys just for who served 1 term. But every president after Washington had the principle that they were done after 2 terms. And this just made it official. And the 22nd Amendment was adopted in 1951. The 23rd Amendment gives Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes. This was adopted in 1961. Washington is an interesting case for talking about federalism because Washington is not considered a part of any state. It's its own individual territory. Funny enough that there was a point in time where people in D.C. could not vote for president, which is really weird to think about, that they were not able to vote for president, even though they're the place that houses our entire government. It makes no sense. And there's still many laws right now that are happening in D.C. that are very weird and odd. But basically, when we talk about federalism, we're going to talk about the structure of our federal government, which is federal, state, and local governments. D.C. has no state structure. They are a local government that answers directly to the federal government. And the federal government has a lot of power over DC law because they hold the budget for DC itself. That is a very odd way to live in a certain city. It has this vibe that it is this controlled city from the federal government. It literally answers to the federal government because it has the federal government in its power. But it gives 3 electoral votes so they can make their case known for president. Mostly they vote Democrat for the most part. They're pretty important in terms of helping the Democrats secure any sort of victory. The 24th Amendment bans poll tax, and this was adopted in 1964. This basically said that people do not have to pay to vote for president or for any sort of office. They do not have to pay any tax on this because there were some areas that were taxing people to pay for their election. And that is something that was definitely a no-no. They do not want people to be taxed because that would probably discourage people from voting if they knew they had to pay a tax to vote every time. There's no way people would do it. It's just a very unfortunate thing that happened. So this 24th Amendment kind of put a stop to that. Then we get to the 25th Amendment, which is basically saying that the vice president will replace the president if necessary. There's been only a couple times that the president actually has had to be just temporarily replaced and not just have somebody take over for him officially, like Lincoln. That happened. That secession happened pretty rapidly after Kennedy was assassinated and Lincoln was. But this is basically saying that the vice president is going to take over if necessary. President Reagan, for example, was shot, I can't remember the year, but it was in the 1980s. There was a time where Vice President Bush, who eventually became president later on, he had to replace Reagan for a couple of weeks and do his duties because he was shot and recovering. So he was not officially president, but they would take over for the roles of president when he was incapacitated. And this was adopted in 1967. There's a whole thing about ascension to the president that's really interesting. During times of crisis, there's like a whole hierarchy. It's president, vice president, speaker of the House, and then there's a couple other president pro tempore of the Senate, who all are in line to take over as a succession to the president if something were to happen. And there was a couple instances where it was pretty messy trying to figure out who would replace who, but now there's a whole line of succession if something were to happen. The 26th Amendment lays out that 18-year-olds are allowed to vote, that anybody who is 18 years old in our country is allowed to vote. This was established in 1971. There's some push to make the voting age 21 in some areas. I doubt that's ever going to happen. There's some to also actually limit and make it younger, that people who are 16 could actually vote potentially, and maybe younger than that because they're going into adulthood. So there's some argument that they want to have more rights to vote, if the younger people should be allowed to have more say in the voting process. As long as you are 18 by the time that election comes around, you are allowed to vote. And that's basically what this is saying, that anyone who is 18 on the day of election is allowed to vote. So you can, if you're 17 and you're turning 18 like a day before, you're allowed to vote. That's absolutely, you're allowed to vote. So you can put in your registration, even though you're not 18 as of that point. By the time that the election comes around, you will be 18. So that's an important distinction for some people to know. The last amendment is the 27th Amendment, and this was adopted. The last one was in 1992. So it's been a couple of years now that we've actually had the amendment pass in Congress. But this was actually one that was interesting because this was actually proposed in 1795. But it took almost 200 years for this actually to be implemented. The 27th Amendment says that Congress can give itself a limited raise, but that won't take effect until after the next election. So this is basically saying that they can't just continually give themselves raises over and over again. But they can give themselves raises, it just won't take effect until after. So this is not going to affect how they're being paid now. It will be affected how they are being paid later. And that's important because there might be some people who would try to just raise their own coffers basically and try to get more and more money, but this kind of limits what they're allowed to do, and they have to win election in order to get that raise basically. And that's it. These are the 27 amendments that we have. So we've gone through the Bill of Rights. We've gone through the additional other, how many is it? 17 other amendments. So this is what our Constitution is. Now that we've kind of established everything about it, we're going to start going into how it actually works. So next week we're going to talk about federalism and what federalism does and how we establish this hierarchy of a federal government, state government, and local government. These amendments are vastly important because now this is how our country is run. And it's a good example of how our Constitution is a living, breathing Constitution, that this thing has the ability to be changed. It's not going to be set in stone all the time. So we can continue to make changes to it when necessary. And maybe there might be some changes that come up in the future that we can all agree on that need to be changed. And hopefully that might happen. We'll see. So thank you guys. I appreciate you listening. Next week, again, we're going to talk about federalism, and we'll get right into more of this coming up on almost the halfway point, give or take, about a third of the way through the semester. So I hope you guys are enjoying the class, and I will see you all next week.